Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Industrial Revolution. We've been working up towards this, and we're finally here, right on the cusp of the final. So, we're going to talk about the forces that come into play that create this absolute paradigm shift in human experience. Everything, every aspect of our lives, from the moment of our birth to the moment of our death now, is radically different than those who lived before the Industrial Revolution. And we're going to explore some of those, and we're going to explore some of the consequences and some of the influences that caused the Industrial Revolution. We must make a connection between this revolution and some of the things that happened before, because revolutions don't happen in a vacuum. They just don't suddenly pop up out of nowhere unless you are willfully ignorant or just horribly blind to what is happening. So there are empires that have been forged by the European countries, places like England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Portugal. They have these worldwide connections, and so they're able to pull a lot of resources. There's a lot of raw materials that are easily found relatively cheaply. There are high demands for labor. We talked about plantations in the past, and we talked about the influx of slaves and slave trading that were necessary to meet the demands of these plantations. Also, mines. Mines were incredibly lucrative, whether precious metals, precious gems, or more mundane metals and minerals like copper, lead, iron, coal. There was high demand for that labor, and that high demand for labor, these were very dangerous jobs. It was very dangerous to work on in mines, slightly less dangerous to work in plantations, but still, nonetheless, grind people down. We also have the scientific revolution, which was a rational approach to the world and understanding how things interact. So you have the emergence of things like engineering and physics and metallurgy and chemistry. These things are incredibly important, and the understanding for these processes are incredibly important for the success of the Industrial Revolution. We also have the Enlightenment actually plays a part in the Industrial Revolution, partly because of the uh, philosophy of how to save money in a capitalist society, but also the questions about the dignity and worth of human lives begin to really come into focus in the Industrial Revolution, where it had been more of an esoteric argument before. Now it's really a test of some of these ideas of what does human life mean? What value does it have? What about human interactions? A business owner to employee, government to citizens, and so on. And then finally, Atlantic revolutions give us proof positive that something somewhere has to give. The old system must meet the demands of a changing world, or things will break down. And when they break down, inevitably, unfortunately, it seems like that breakdown comes at the cost of human lives and violence. So we have all of these factors that play a part in creating, sustaining, or being a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. Now, before we go too much further, we do want to get into some ideas and some terms so that you have at least a little familiarity when we move forward. So the first term that we're going to talk about is laissez-faire. It's a French word meaning to leave it alone or let it be. And this emerges as an economic theory that is overlaid onto capitalism, where it essentially posits that a business functions best if it is governed the least. So governments need to basically keep their hands off or leave alone the businesses. Now, there is a lot to be said for this, but there's also a lot to critique because leaving businesses alone and having no governmental influence on businesses can lead to some really, really bad consequences. And perhaps the result of a road paved with good intentions. Another term that we're going to come up with, and something that you should be familiar with, is the concept of time zones. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the world operated on very localized time. Time was very fluid. Many cities did indeed have clocks. Maybe they had a central clock, or they had some kind of bell tower that would be rung, whether it was a church bell or maybe a municipal bell, that would tell the hour, would tell you roughly when noon was, tell you roughly when sunset was, tell you roughly when the sunrise was. But for the majority of humans who lived in rural areas, about 90 some odd percent of the populace, the world was governed as it has always been by the sunrise and sunset, by the movement of the seasons, by the weather, and by the growing season. That begins to change. Time zones are an attempt by humans to make the world more predictable, to try to bend the world to human will. Now, there is a lot of problems with that, of course. Time zones are a very blunt and crude tool in which to measure the passage of time, but it's also a very important tool that allows the Industrial Revolution to really kind of spread across the world. And then finally, when I mentioned something has to give, of course, we have to talk about sabotage, violence against the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. Sabotage, actually, another French word from sabot, which is a wooden shoe that a lot of peasants would have been shod with. Leather is expensive because cows at the time, pigs, goats, whatever, they are very expensive relatively. And so not a lot of material is around to make leather shoes. Leather shoes are something of a luxury. So the majority of people either went barefoot, which was absolutely true, up until, well, still, even today, most people do go barefoot, or they have some kind of sandal on there, often a wood-soled sandal, or in the case of European, in order to the enclosed toe shoe to keep the foot a little bit warm and a little bit more protected, wooden shoes. I know it's now kind of synonymous with Holland or the quaintness of Dutch shoes and weird wooden shoes, but the reality was most people wore wooden shoes. And sabotage comes around because in order to make a stand against the increased mechanization of the world, a lot of workers would break machinery. And one of the ways you could break machinery was to throw your wooden shoe into the gears. The gears would get bound up. It would create a feedback loop on the machinery, and the machinery would literally sunder itself or it would burn out. And it became very costly to replace it. And this was mostly to defend relatively high-paying jobs, um, ones that paid fairly well and allowed a provider to sustain their family. And machinery threatened that way of life. So what is the Industrial Revolution? At its core, it's that machinery, unthinking, unfeeling, untiring machinery replaces muscle power. Up until about 1750, the majority of work, the vast, vast majority of work, about 99.8% of work was done through the use of muscle, whether it was animal muscle or human muscle. Everything from the construction of the pyramids at Giza to the construction of the Colosseum, the building of roads, the building of ships, the creation of textiles, the refinement of sugar, you name it, it was all done through physical demanding labor. And this change is so radical. This machinery supplanting muscles is so radical that today we don't even think about how much energy we use just by waking up in the morning and having our cup of coffee or our breakfast or going to work or going to school or even listening to a lecture online. So in a way, machinery and the Industrial Revolution makes the miraculous mundane. It makes it kind of boring. I want you to think about waking up at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning in order to go to work. If you wake up during the winter or in the very early hours, most likely you got up and you went to the wall and you flipped a switch and turned lights on so that you can see what you're doing. Where does that electricity come from? Who generates it? Is it generated down the block? Is there somebody in your house that generates it? Is it miles away? Is it hundreds of miles away? How does it get to your house? And think about the wiring that's necessary to stretch that electricity from the place that it's generated to your house and the wiring in the house that makes the light possible. And you don't even think about the safety of it. In the years before the Industrial Revolution, especially the years before electricity became popularized, most people had to light candles and you had to see by candlelight. And you think about the heating in your house and about how much energy goes into keeping your house at a comfortable temperature. You would have had to, in the 1700s or in the early 1800s, you would have had to get up and stoke a fire and really get the fire going to warm you up. Meanwhile, you're shivering with cold because your house was drafty or maybe poorly insulated. So the miraculous, this unbelievable amount of energy we all have at the tips of our fingers that we don't even think about, that we take for granted, is absolutely mind-bogglingly like magic to people who would have lived in previous centuries. Even as early as the early 20th century, or even as recently as the early 20th century, some of this stuff would have been just absolutely unthinkable. The ability to get on a plane and fly from here to India in a few hours, is startlingly quick. And also during this industrial revolution, we begin to see a trend that continues well into the 21st century, and that is a shift of the concentration of people from rural um, farming areas to urban. This also means that there's a shift in the way that people interact with each other, in the way that laws are made, in the way that time is understood, the foods that we eat. Basically, all of reality is upended. Now, it doesn't all happen at once. The Industrial Revolution is not a point in time, although our books talk about 1750 to 1850 as the quote industrial revolution unquote, and then they move on. That is an artificial construct. The Industrial Revolution is still happening. It is still happening today, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the lecture. But it changes our reality. It changes the way we perceive the world and the way that we perceive even each other. So I want you to think about your day so far. I've kind of touched on this. So how far away is your house from Thomas More's campus or any campus, any school whatsoever? And I want you to think about how long it would take you to walk that distance. If, let's say, you lived 10 miles, a relatively close distance, 10 miles away from Thomas More's campus, and you had to walk, and humans walk about 2 miles per hour. It would take you a good chunk of the day just to get to campus. Now, that doesn't include the time that you need to do your work. It doesn't include the time that you need to study. That is just walking. Sure, you could read while walking. Why not? But 5 hours to get to campus and then 5 hours to get back home. That's 10 hours out of your 24-hour day. That is a lot of time. Now compare that with perhaps getting in your car. If you had to drive 10 miles in your car, how long would it take you? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Let's say it takes you 10 minutes. Let's say it takes you 20 minutes or even 30 minutes. It takes you 30 minutes. The traffic is really horrible to get 10 miles. You can't believe it. You're so frustrated. And you get out of your car and you realize you just saved you just realize you saved 4.5 hours by being able to get in that car. That is an amazing amount of energy that you've invested into your car and being able to get into your campus that is suddenly gone. Those 4.5 hours, boom, they're gone. You've got 4.5 more hours. What about the energy that you used to light your room? We've already kind of touched on that. What kind of source creates that energy? Is it steam power? If it's steam power, what creates the steam? Is it a natural geyser? Is it geothermal? Is it solar? Is it coal? Where does that coal come from if it's coal? If it's natural gas, where does that natural gas come from? We've got this amazing amount, this matrix of wonders that allow us to turn a switch and be able to heat up an oven to be able to cook our food. But where does that food come from? Most of the time, most people living in Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, the majority of the food that you have comes from halfway around the world, if not at least halfway across the country. California, for example, the Central Valley in California produces 90% of the vegetables eaten in the United States. That's Central Valley of California. That's 2,000 miles away. So how does it get to your table? All because of the Industrial Revolution, all because of mechanization. Machines harvest your broccoli. Machines harvest your carrots. Machines harvest your wheat. Machines process your food. They package it, transport it. Machines even count up how much it costs for you to get that food. And machines process your payment. And a machine takes you to the grocery store and from the grocery store. Machinery, machinery, machinery everywhere. But keep in mind that this transition, this period is not a smooth or planned transition. It's not like there was some grand architect. There were some fits and starts, and that it does have a lot of bumps in the road. And as much as we can talk about how wonderful and amazing our life is now, the Industrial Revolution creates as many problems as it solves. For as much energy we save in the morning trying to light candles or light lamps so that we can see, so we can get dressed, so that we can do our work. As much as energy we personally save, we consume way more energy in terms of carbon dioxide output by coal-fired plants or natural gas plants or running our car engine or heating our house or things like that. And so this may cause some problems, pollution problems, atmospheric problems, climate change problems. It also creates social issues. They present moral quandaries, and they open up the door for new types of corruption and new chances at reform. So there's a lot of give and take that happened because of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution really finds its foothold in England, and England is the most industrialized nation in the world for about 100 years, from roughly 1750, although the kind of precursors to the Industrial Revolution are happening decades beforehand, things like the steam engine. They're invented decades beforehand, but they really reach a critical mass starting about 1750. And by about 1850, which is when most historians say, oh, the Industrial Revolution, that's over. That is not true in my personal view. The Industrial Revolution is continuing. The Industrial Revolution between 1750 and 1850, England is really where it's at in terms of creating new machinery, creating new processes, making new discoveries, expanding the overall economy, the gross national product, the ability to mass produce and that sort of thing. And that is largely due to the importation of raw materials from colonies and the exportation to colonial markets that really help kind of fuel the Industrial Revolution because it is very much tied, at least initially, to the needs of the markets. Later on, capitalism kind of gets imprinted on top of. Remember, capitalism doesn't really isn't articulated until 1776 with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and it's not really until the 1820s that 1830s or so, 1820s or 1830s that British political will really embraces this economic theory of capitalism. So although we like to think that capitalism really created a lot of innovation, it's really the innovation that allowed capitalism to kind of be embraced as an economic policy. And it's not just capitalism that creates innovation. Innovation can happen in a variety of economic conditions. It just depends on the conditions that are present. So why England, though? England, compared to the rest of the world, is a small, teeny tiny little island. It is a relatively backwater at the beginning of our time together when we talk about the 1500s or 1600s. Relatively small army, relatively unimportant on the world stage, especially compared to places like India and China. Well, England has a lot of things going for it that India and China don't. That small population paradoxically works to the advantage of England. Small population, especially coming out of the Black Plague of the 1300s, means that a lot of skilled laborers were paid relatively high wages. In fact, English workers were the best paid workers in Europe, period. And in fact, they were probably some of the best paid workers in the world. And that tradition of high pay continued. It was very difficult to try to pay somebody less than their father earned, for example, or their grandfather earned for the same kind of skills. Relatively low population, relatively low labor pool meant that there was an emphasis on labor saving devices. And that's true going back for quite some time in England. There's a little bit of a parallel in Japan that I'm not going to cover, but it's kind of the same thing. This miniaturization, labor saving, that sort of thing, this kind of fascination with the ability to get things done with as little effort as possible. Uh, and of course, England had deep resources that it could pull upon. A culture of innovation that I mentioned just a minute ago, but also rich deposits of coal and iron. Those were important in order to fuel the Industrial Revolution. It is this kind of positive feedback loop that creates more machines. Machines, especially the very hard-working machines, were created out of steel. Steel is created from primarily iron and a pulverized version of coal called coke, C-O-K-E, that would infuse a lot of carbon into the iron and create a steel. Steel is very much more resilient. It is somewhat flexible, but it is um, much better weight to strength ratio than iron does. Iron has a tendency to go a little soft after a while, and so it has to be built really, really thick. That doesn't really work for machinery. You need relatively thin parts that are going to be able to endure hours and hours and days and months and perhaps years and years of use. You also have what I term a buyer's market. England is purchasing a lot of products, a lot of goods, a lot of luxuries from all over the world. And so there's this desire to create enough to offset how much England is importing. So things like tea, silk, dyes, rice, exotic spices, those sort of things, they are expensive. And so there's a desire within England to try to find a way to make enough money to actually pay for that lavish lifestyle that everybody is trying to kind of one up each other. Now compare that to India and China. Both India and China have very, very big populations. That means that relatively speaking, wages are low. There's a lot of unpaid or underskilled labor that does a lot of mundane tasks. The production of certain types of fabrics, for example, were often hand stamped. So if you look at a pattern on a dress, or you look at a pattern on clothing, a lot of that would have in this period in the 1750s been hand stamped. They create a wood block. It's just like stamping a letter. You wet it with ink, you press it onto the cloth, wet it on ink, press it on a cloth, on and on and on. A stamp would have probably been about the size of your hand. So if you're creating yards and yards and yards and yards and yards, it's going to take you a long time. Well, you need a lot of people to be able to do that in a relatively quick period. So you hired a lot of people. That's true in China and India. Relatively large populations, the two largest population centers. So they had a lot of people that they could replace. This drives wages down. The India and China both had access to resources. They both had a culture of innovation. China and India have a long scientific tradition stretching back thousands of years, everything from numbers to medicine to astronomy to early metallurgy and that sort of thing, chemistry. All of that comes out of India and China. Uh, but what's different is, unlike, say, England's deep reserves of coal and iron that create a feedback loop of positivity, there is access to iron and coal in India, maybe a little bit more spread apart, maybe less impetus because you don't need machinery as much because you've got cheap labor. So machines are relatively expensive comparatively. It's just easier to hire people. Same in China. China has deep reserves of coal. They have lots of iron, but there's not that need because both India and China also have luxuries that they're exporting. Lucrative luxuries that need minimal processing. Dyes, silk, spices, you can send out and let others process that. So essentially, India and China have a seller's market. People are coming to them for their products. There's really no need to try to become more competitive. They already are the apex. If you had like China as is level A, maybe India is level A minus ish in how much they're exporting. So they're making a lot of money. So there's not really a drive to try to catch up. Whereas England was probably around, B minus, maybe C plus for production. So they need to really get some more money. They need to up their grade, as it were. So, what are the roots of England's revolution? Well, Britain in the 1750s had, as I mentioned before, rich coal deposits, rich surface iron, a relatively small population, and relatively expensive labor. They do, however, have also a large colonial support. Even with losing the colonies in 1776 to 1780s, even with losing the North American colonies, they still have a vast amount of colonial support. So it's not like this was like a death blow to England. England got along just fine without the North American colonies. So we see here in this map of England and going into Scotland that where the iron deposits were, so those little black dots, and the major coal fields, these compressed, um, truly ancient forests that have been smushed over time and turned into this carbon-rich mineral that allows for a very an incredible amount of energy transfer. And also, in England, the Industrial Revolution, as I mentioned before, about that pull from the rural area to the more urban areas, there is a demographic shift between 1700 and 1900, which bracket this Industrial Revolution period very nicely. In 1700, the majority of people, represented in blue, lived in rural areas. Roughly in England, roughly 75 to 78% of the people lived in a rural community. They lived on the farm, they lived on the ranch, they lived in the hills by the ocean. They were fishermen, whatever. So they had lived rural lives. That changes by 1900 to almost the perfect opposite. About 23% of people in England are living in rural areas in 1900, on the cusp of the 20th century. Now, to give you an idea of how that happens, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens really during this Industrial Revolution because of some of the forces we're about to explore. This concept of efficiency, the forcing out of small, well-paid workers out of certain industries, and the gravitation towards cities by the working poor. Um, so there's a huge matrix of influences. We've been talking about how all these different parts come into play. And we see that matrix begin to kind of coalesce and create a pressure point that allows for the Industrial Revolution to happen and then accelerates the Industrial Revolution once it does happen. Now, it used to be in England, and we're going to stay with England as our example because there's a lot of European counterparts that are true and a lot of American and Canadian counterparts that are true. Um, in general, land was held in for the common good of all. In theory, the king, whether an absolutist monarch or a constitutional monarchy, would have been in charge of all of the land that they ruled over. They held it in trust from God and then disseminated it to landlords, so the aristocracy. And the aristocracy had a role to play in maintaining the common good. The aristocracy could be rapacious, they could be unfair, absolutely. You had people like that, but they also had people who were very generous and people who legitimately sought to protect their people. These so-called landlords were essentially caretakers. They were the intermediaries. They oversaw the land and oversaw the workers, and in exchange for what the workers extracted, they provided protection for the workers, often provided housing, some kind of social network to prevent them from starving. Now, did it mean it always worked? Absolutely not. Sometimes the laws were horribly, horribly unfair, and in general, peasants didn't eat the best. They didn't eat the most variety of foods. Often it was a vegetarian diet. But essentially, landlords had to be caretakers. In the medieval period, in say 1500 or 1600, it would not have been unusual for the landlord to throw parties roughly every 2 or 3 weeks, some kind of festival, often related to some religious observances. So there would be feasts, sometimes there would be entertainment, sometimes that entertainment would be as simple as getting troubadours or musicians to come in and play, or it could be jousting tournaments, or it could be wrestling, it could be all sorts of funny dancing, it could be celebration of weddings, whatever. The landlord paid for a lot of these. And in fact, you had more paid, for lack of a better term, more paid holidays if you were a peasant in 1500 than if you're a worker in the 21st century. Something like 4-to-1 ratio. Peasants had more paid celebrated holidays. Did they have a better standard of living? No, most likely not. But it was not unusual for peasants to work their way up. They could become reeves or supervisors. They could become sheriffs or sheriffs. They could become law enforcement, essentially. They could become lawyers. They could become managers or milliners or weavers or whatever. And so there was some social fluidity. And a lot of this was sponsored by lords and ladies who paid for people to go to apprenticeships, who paid for beer to be produced, who paid for the mill to be run, and so there were some common goods that were held. And not all land was perfectly arable. Some land was relatively marginal, what was often referred to as wasteland. As you know, anybody who lives is going to create waste, whether their own bodily functions or through the side effects of eating. For example, if you have an onion, you're not going to eat the skin. You're probably not going to eat the root part. You're going to throw that away. So that becomes waste. Things like excess leaves or the shearings from your hair when you get a haircut, all of that stuff, all of that's waste. Well, that needs to go somewhere. And that was often dumped in the wastelands. The wastelands were not just a dumping, but they were also allowed to lay fallow. So there's this old medieval method of farming where crops were rotated in and out of lands. You didn't grow the same crop on the same land all the time. It's a recipe for disaster. People have known that for thousands of years. So they would plant one type of goods or one type of produce in the land one year, plant a different type the next year. Third year, maybe it laid fallow, so it would be considered wasteland. These were marginal producers at best. This was also a kind of poverty insurance. Um, this is backed up by biblical tradition in which the the Bible prescribes that people who are poor should be able to go and pick at the edges of the fields and pick up the corn and when we say corn, we mean grain. Pick up the bits of grain that were left, chase the birds off, and pick up the grain for themselves so that they don't starve. And then that's also reinforced in the New Testament, where Christ tells people to allow the poor to wander through their fields, to wander through the fields of the farmer and take whatever grain that they can grasp with their hands. Now they can't cut it, they can't cut the plants down, but if they happen to run their hand across a sheaf of wheat and some grains fall into their hands, well, that's obviously something that God wanted them to have, and you shouldn't begrudge them that. So there is this very robust social network to essentially address poverty and destitution and the elderly and those who are incapacitated. In the 1750s and as we get into the early 1800s, especially as the concept of capitalism begins to be embraced by industrialists and by uh, English law, we get land is no longer seen as being held in trust, but rather as an expression of your material wealth. And we get to see a change in the way that wealth is measured. Um, Often, wealth being wealthy becomes increasingly associated with being more righteous or more loved by God. God is giving you a bounty. That bounty is expanding. God must love you more. And that's probably because you're a very virtuous person. It's a very selfish and narcissistic way of viewing Christianity. And then the flip side, of course, is that those who are poor, obviously they're lazy. God is punishing them with bad fortune. If only they would be more virtuous. If only they were more capitalist, basically. And so you get to see this change in the attitude towards land. Land begins to be enclosed. Signs begin to be put up. Um, Trespassers begin to be prosecuted, people who would normally be able to wander through your fields and just run their hand across your barley or your oats or your wheat and grasp a few of these little corns that fall off. They're now thieves who are prosecuted and often beaten and jailed. Uh, Even marginal land, those wastelands, whether where the garbage dumps were, or the fallow lands, or the lands that really didn't produce, that maybe had poor soil, they begin to be enclosed, and in order to feed the Industrial Revolution, particularly the textile mills, sheep begin to be put on that land, and because the wool produced from sheep essentially is um, a cash crop to be harvested, that puts more value on the land, and so other people living on your land who may have lived there for hundreds of years, but now you personally own that wasteland, you can kick them off. And so you dispossess rural poor. Tenant farmers, people who can't afford to purchase the land, who rent the land from you and give you a portion of their crops in return, what in the United States becomes known as sharecropping. Those rents become increasingly high to the point where many tenant farmers can't afford to stay on land, and so with nothing left to fall back on, they begin to drift further and closer to the cities. They hear jobs are available, or maybe their relatives have retreated to the cities, and so they also retreat to the cities. That's part of why we see that demographic shift. Another reason that we see the demographic shift is that although maybe the rural poor who are forced off of their land find themselves with nowhere else to go, maybe some of that demographic shift also comes because dangerous jobs are no longer occupied. And that largely is due to the invention of the steam engine. Now, the steam engine has a very, very humble start. Um, when digging into the earth, anybody who has ever dug any real depth into the earth knows that eventually you get to this place called the water table. It's the point at which in the soil that there's a lot of water just kind of trapped by the soil. And when you create a hole, that water is able to pour out. And so you get the hole that you build, the hole that you dig begins to be filled with water. It's the basis behind wells, essentially. But if you're pursuing valuable minerals, you don't want that water there. You want that water out because it interferes with people being able to extract those minerals. So mines are often flooded. And the way that that flooding was dealt with varied from culture to culture, but essentially it was a chain of people bucket brigading to bail out this water. Very, very labor intensive. So let's say you go down, 20 meters into the ground, so about roughly 22 yards, 21 yards. Um, and you begin to have water filling up. Well, if you leave for the night and come back and there's 4 feet of water, you're not going to be able to dig very much more for your copper, your coal, your sulfur, whatever you're trying to extract. In fact, it may even ruin your ability to extract it. So you need to bail that out. So you would have to hire a bunch of people just to bail your water out. They're not producing anything, so they need to be able to, you need to be able to pull that water out with as little effort as possible. Now, early versions of these pumps were often wind powered. So by the 1600s, by the 1500s, again, we're going to go revisit the Netherlands, the synonymous windmill phenomena. Windmills were driven by the wind in order to power a pump that would then suck the water out. Well, what happens if the wind isn't blowing in the right direction? Or what if the wind is too weak to blow? Or what if it's blowing so strongly that it could potentially destroy your machinery? Well, then you're out of luck. You have to wait for the wind to come back and at the right speed, and then hurry up and dig while you have the chance to keep pumping that water out. Well, along comes the steam engine. Steam engine begins to um, afford a level of predictability and control to the amount of water that you can pump out. So steam engines have a very humble start. They're just pumping machines. Then later they get attached to coal mining carts or steel mining or iron mining carts or things like that to be able to pull the actual ore out because they're more reliable than maybe the people or the horses that were used. They go from mines to being used on railroads, which is the transportation of goods to manufacturing centers, and they also become used in the mechanization of a whole host of industries. So they very quickly begin to become extremely useful. They become indispensable to the Industrial Revolution. So why machinery? Well, machines never tire. And this is a pencil sketch of what it was like to be a miner in the period before the Industrial Revolution. At the very front, you see the individual climbing. Yes, that is a small boy. The person pushing, bending back almost double, trying to get a cart up the hill in order to get that coal or whatever ore that they're taking out, that is a man. Um, Machines never get tired. They are consistent. They are replaceable, and they can be repaired. Unlike the people who have to maybe be uh, take time to recoup if they break a leg, who may never work again in the mines and has to be replaced. If a wheel or a gear breaks on a machine, you can take that wheel or that gear off and replace it with a similar one, and the machine's back up and running. So essentially, steam engines improve mine efficiency. They start off with, as I mentioned before, replacing those little ponies or the people who are pulling the ore out of the mines. Well, once they get them out of the mines, it becomes almost a no-brainer to then just keep them on carts or to load them onto similar rail carts to bring them to the factories. So railroads begin to expand from mines to factories, and then from those mechanized factories to their markets, because it makes sense that if you're going to produce steel, for example, steel is also very heavy. It is not likely that you're going to be able to find enough draft horses at a reasonable price to be able to transport your very valuable steel to market and still be able to make a profit. The reliance on railroads makes that disappear. You don't have to worry about draft horses and teamsters and loads and loads of wagons to transport your steel to market. You can load it onto a train that then consistently is able to run at a predictable speed. It also allows for the movement of people. Very quickly, people begin to utilize trains to move from point A to point B, or use steamships to move from point A to point B. So cargo, also the moving of cargo becomes incredibly efficient, and it creates this very positive feedback loop. It's cheap to produce, it's cheap to extract, it's cheap to transport, and you can get new goods in because although you may have intended for the steel to go to the port, and the steel gets loaded on the ship. Well, now maybe some imported iron or imported coal or imported cotton comes in and goes back to the market. So it creates this very positive feedback loop to keep using railroads and keep using steam travel. So, and I want you to think about how you and I travel. And I want you to think about how we measure a journey. For example, how many miles is it from your house to Louisville? Give me an exact number. Can you think of an exact number? Now, I want you to think about how many hours it takes for you to get from your house to Louisville. And do you see the difference? How quickly you can come up with an idea of how long it takes you to get to Louisville, but not how many miles it is to Louisville. It's a little bit harder to do the miles. In pre-industrial time, it would have been more likely that you would have measured in miles, and to travel 10 miles or 100 miles would have been an astounding feat for pre-mechanized society. But now, traveling 100 miles, say from northern Kentucky to Louisville, that can be done in just a couple of hours. That's an easy journey. It's an astounding change. So machines who are essentially tireless, they don't get hungry, they don't get thirsty, they don't get exhausted. They do need to be maintained, absolutely, but tireless machines make travel and production possible all year round. Now, I had mentioned earlier in the lecture that most human life was tied to the seasons and the rhythms of the seasons, very much closer to the land, very much closer to the environment. Now we become more and more disconnected from the environment, and we impose artificial timelines and timetables and predictability into it. So travel and production become possible all year round. Machines absolutely do need to be serviced by humans, but increasingly machines are replacing humans. They make the production much more efficient. You need fewer people to supervise machines than you did to actually create the product. So a lot of people are being displaced from their jobs. Let's take an example. All right. When we're talking about cloth production, the way that a lot of cloth production had traditionally been handled was through what was called cottage work or let out pieces in England. So during the times when you were waiting for the crops to grow, or maybe you were waiting for the winter to pass, or whatever, anytime that you were not actively out there sowing the seeds, weeding the fields, chasing off vermin, and harvesting, all that other time you have basically downtime. You are doing some other stuff. Maybe you're creating wooden shoes for you and your neighbors. Maybe you are doing some let out work. So women, for instance, would sew pieces, little pieces together over and over and over again. So two sides of a shirt they might put together. And so this downtime money making was important for farmers because it sustained them through the winter months when they weren't having money coming in from their harvests. It sustained them during the summer months when they didn't have money coming in, when they were just waiting for the for the produce to be ripe enough to harvest and sell off. But it was very inconsistent because skill level varied from person to person, and it was also very slow because sometimes demands of the farm maybe took priority over this let out work. So as a system, it is a very flawed system, a very inconsistent system. Now compare that with machine manufacturing. You can program or essentially build a machine that will do one task over and over and over and over again. That machine will work year round, it will work night and day, and it will always turn out the same product. So it is extremely consistent, far more reliable. It also turns out to be far more cheap. And so you have a replacement of cottage work with more machine manufacturing. So everything from the spinning of wool to the weaving of cloth to the dyeing process to sewing, you name it, is replaced by machines, bits and pieces. And the machine factories become far larger, they become more efficient, they become more wealth producing. And so uh, as that happens, as those machines expand, the cottage work disappears, it dries up. So imagine you're a business owner. Which makes more economic sense? Does it make more sense to maintain your ties to this cottage industry or the let out industry? Or do you want to take out a loan and invest in machine manufacturing? And why would you do that? Why would you make either of those decisions? What kind of costs are involved in creating an item? What goes into the manufacture of, let's say, clothing? Well, if you're a entrepreneur in the 1800s, you know that railroads and steamships are keeping cost of transportation of both your products and your raw materials relatively predictable. It's not going to be a big surprise. You know when they're going to arrive. You within reason. You know where they're going to go within reason. You know when you can expect payment. Machines likewise make manufacture and the cost of manufacturing predictable. So it's the same product over and over and over again and the same price over and over and over again. So what are the other ways that you can save money? Because you've taken out loans to build your, let's say, cloth manufactory, um, and you want to be successful, you want to expand your business, you want to be able to be known as maybe the best manufacturer in all of England of tablecloths or of a certain type of fabric. So how else can you save money? Well, you have your choice. You could hire some highly skilled men who are used to relatively high wages, You can hire more women who are relatively skilled, maybe not as skilled weavers. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But they're going to be lower wages. And then on top of that, even better, you could hire children who are relatively unskilled, who are absolutely unskilled, but are incredibly cheap. So we've got these moral quandaries, and England is wrestling with these moral quandaries. But their success in dealing with these moral quandaries is very hit and miss. To the outside world, however, England is doing a bang up job. They're doing an amazing job. Great Britain leads the way as a industrial revolution powerhouse for about 100 years and attracts copycats. Belgium and Germany soon, Germany soon after consolidation begins to rapidly industrialize. And by 1870, Germany has as much productive capacity as Britain does. So for as much production as Britain is putting out, Germany is also putting out. For as consistent as those products are, they are equally consistent from Germany. France, Russia, and Japan kind of, instead of embracing this very laissez-faire capitalist kind of structure, they opt for a more state-sponsored industrialization to one degree of success or another. France, middlingly successful. Russia, not terribly successful. Japan, amazingly successful, even though it's state-sponsored and state-directed industrialization. The United States has a bit of an interruption in the middle of its ramping up of its productive capacity. That interruption is the Civil War that happens in the 1860s. But by the 1870s, the United States begins to surpass Britain in manufacturing capability. And even by 1900, when we get to 1900, the United States is still ramping up, still has a lot of room to grow and is still an expanding economy, roughly. So this leads to some of the issues that we talked about with time. Um, One of the things to make life or make manufacturing really more predictable was to change people's lives rather than a pre-industrial kind of concept of time and work and when things happen, we need to shift to a more industrial method of understanding time and production and manufacture. Now, the start and end shifts in these factories, if you're a entrepreneur, you very tightly regulate. You want everybody at their workstations at such and such a time, and they can go home at a different time. And it's predictable day in, day out. You know you're going to get X amount of work out of every person. And there are even efficiency experts begin to emerge by the end of the 19th century who say this is the way to make your workers more effective. This is the way to make your workers more efficient. This is the way we need to supervise them to make sure they're not slacking off, they're not getting tired, they're not getting bored, they're not getting distracted. And one of the ways was to ensure that everybody arrived at work at the same time, not drips and drabs and dribble in and kind of traipse in whenever you want. So increasingly, people's lives are governed by the clock at work and ruled by the clock outside of work. For example, a good example of the tyranny of the clock is this role that emerged in 19th century Britain called the knocker upper. A very funny name, but the knocker upper was somebody who got up and probably stayed up relatively late, and in the mornings would go around and hit people's windows with a stick or would throw little pebbles at people's windows or whatever. They would essentially knock on the windows to wake people up so they would know it's time for them to get ready to go to work. And in exchange, that person was paid a few pennies. So the knocker upper would go around and knock on people's windows, knock on people's doors, making sure he or she was a human alarm clock to wake the neighborhood up. The workday in general was usually 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week, 12 or more hours a day, and they were regulated just like a clock. Human beings were fit into this machine-like paradigm. We can predict the machine will pour out X amount of, let's say, handkerchiefs an hour. The person who supervised that should be able to run X amount of machines and make sure that those machines meet that production goal. And that was largely possible because most people who worked in the factory lived near the factory. And so you would get factory towns. You have people who would go to work, they would come home, they lived near or within sight or within hearing range of the factory. And this is a good example from the early days of Cincinnati. We have a factory far off in the distance there, and we have some houses that live right across the fence line from where the production facilities are. And time was regulated beyond just the factory or beyond just the town. You have an agreement, an international agreement that is struck by the European countries to divide the world up into 24 roughly equal zones of time, these so-called time zones. And that was largely to ensure that you could predict when a train would arrive. If in England, noon was whenever the sun was highest at any given day. That changed depending on the season because sometimes that peak in the sky would be reached much quicker in the winter and much later in the summer. That doesn't work if you're going to be shipping stuff internationally. So this scheme of timetables and time zones was created and agreed to by international companies to regulate and make more predictable railway and steamship travel. It also allowed for the more coordinated exchange of goods and services and people around the globe. And so we get to see the emergence of true globalization. I talked many lectures back about a kind of proto-globalization when we talk about the exchange of goods directly from, say, Europe to China or vice versa, or India to Europe and vice versa. Got that kind of semi-proto early stage developing globalization. Well, here, globalization is beginning. It is truly born with the creation of time zones. And this gives you an example of what time zones look now. Now, excuse me. Now imagine that you are a working class laborer. Imagine, your father or your grandfather had to move to the city, or maybe you had to move to the city, and you no longer live in this rural, idyllic uh, community where your day is determined by the rising and setting of the sun, and your production ends when the light fades. Instead, you are working 12, 14, or even 16 hours a day in often dangerous conditions because although it was less dangerous than perhaps, say, a miner, it was still very dangerous. There were no safety regulations in place, so it was entirely possible that those machines who are used to, for example, uh, cutting gigantic bolts of cloth, they wouldn't stop to worry about your hand if that hand got in the way. It would cut straight through that hand just like it did that bolt of cloth. And then what happens if you lose a hand? You're also in constant fear of losing your job, especially to others. There was that influx of poor people coming into the cities. They were often pitted against each other. Groups of poor people were pitted against each other. This is particularly true in the United States, where immigrant groups were pitted against each other. If you were Irish immigrants, perhaps you might lose your job to Black Americans or to Italians or Poles or Slavs or Russians or you name it. They could possibly be taking you. It could be that one day you come to work and Your boss tells you you're all fired, go home, you're not getting paid. We've hired new people in its place. And this is true also in England, though to a smaller degree. There were immigrant populations that came to England in the 1800s and the late 1700s, particularly Germans, Italians, and Irish, who were pitted against each other. But also working communities were pitted against each other. Groups from one town or from one particular province or one particular shire were pitted against each other as well. So you're constantly in fear of losing your job. You're working in dangerous conditions for really long hours. You're living in cramped, squalid conditions, and you're essentially treated as disposable. You are as discardable as a burnt out cog in a machine. So how do you, as a worker, stand up for yourself? Well, labor is important to the continued profitability of the Industrial Revolution and to a later capitalist system. Owners begin to hire children and women for low to medium skilled jobs. Children and women work in mining, textiles, clothing, and men, especially skilled men, are relatively expensive because that tradition um, of being relatively well paid. They belong to associations called guilds or what would kind of be sort of like unions. And so they're expecting certain level of respect and autonomy within their jobs that they're not getting with these manufacturing jobs. Women had been excluded from guilds mostly. Children absolutely excluded from guilds until they became journeymen and masters. So they don't have the same expectations, so they're paid much lower, and so you're losing your job to these children, to these to your son, to your daughter, to your wife, you name it, to your mother, who knows. And so you have an increasingly uneasy and restive male population who are essentially emasculated by losing their job. They can't provide for their family the way that maybe their father, their grandfather, or their great grandfather did, that they're culturally expected to. And you have a level of dissatisfaction that's beginning to rise up, especially because just because you hire women or children doesn't necessarily mean that you treat them any better. It was not unusual for children to be killed or maimed and then find themselves out of a job. And now they're facing the next 30, 40, 50 years of their life without, without a limb, without an eye, or horribly disfigured because of some industrial accident. And this can lead to a lot of anger and a lot of upset. Now let's shift away from England, but kind of keep England off to the side a little bit because England does play an interesting role in uh, the continued exploitation of other workers. You remember how I mentioned about losing your job to others, quote unquote others? Well, part of that is fueled by racial tensions. And although in England, the institution of slavery had been outlawed in the homeland in 1803 and outlawed in the colonies 30 years later, England still had a deep, deep investment in the slave trade. Not directly trading slaves, but very indirectly. Now, the British banks were the most lucrative in the world. They were the strongest banks in the world and had been for quite some time. And if you were an American entrepreneur, let's say, for example, if you wanted to expand your plantation, you lived in Louisiana, you wanted to plant more cotton, you couldn't really get a sizable enough loan in the United States to be able to pay for that land, to pay for the labor that would be needed to work that land, and to pay for any other expenses that are associated with expanding your business. So you often went to English banks. They offered the best, I apologize, they offered the best um, rates for your loans, and they had the most secure capital. They weren't going to disappear overnight and then leave you stuck with a massive bill. Maybe that entire mortgage had come due when the bank collapses. Now, the way that loans worked, mortgages worked, is they needed collateral. A lot of collateral could not be transported or repossessed. They were not very worthwhile for British banks. So, for example, you couldn't take out a mortgage on land. Land was essentially super cheap and relatively worthless in the United States, at least in the eyes of the British banks. So you couldn't take out a loan on the land. So what did you take a loan out? Well, you took a loan out against the labor potential of your slaves. And so, in a way, the institution of slavery from about 1800 all the way to 1860 was fueled by British money. And the expansion of slavery in the United States, the increasingly harsh institutionalization of slavery was really reinforced with capital that was brought over from England to the United States. In fact, the value of the mortgaged slaves, because slaves could be repossessed if you went bankrupt, they couldn't take your land away from you. Well, they would take your land, but it wasn't really worth as much as the products that you were producing, and especially not as much as the mortgage that you took out. They would have agents take your slaves away. You would lose your slaves because slaves are property. So although England and English entrepreneurs had no direct tie to slavery, their agents in the United States did have a direct tie in the United States to slavery. And that perpetuation of slavery led to the relatively cheap production of cotton. It also fueled a lot of resentment in the United States, especially in the North, where cheap cotton was sold to England, but it was much more expensive to get American cotton if you were, let's say, a New England textile manufacturer than it was for a English textile manufacturer. And so this leads to a lot of resentment in capitalists in the United States towards slave owners, which leads to a lot of the tension that we see emerge in the United States prior to the Civil War. And also, workers resented black slaves, paradoxically, as being the ones who were taking away their livelihood, because that cotton was being harvested relatively cheaply for England, but they had to pay, their bosses had to pay way more for that cotton to just be shipped to, say, Massachusetts or New York or Pennsylvania. And so there was a lot of resentment that somehow it was the slaves' fault for not, I guess, working for wages, which would then make the cotton much cheaper for Americans to buy and much more expensive for the English to buy. So we follow the trail. We have intricate, colorful, well-made cloth that is created in England to compete in Indian markets, to essentially undercut Indian manufacturers, because you do need to sell these somewhere, and you can only sell so many to the home market. So a lot of the imperial policies in England and in other countries as well was about dumping goods somewhere else, about finding markets, for lack of a better term. And one of the biggest markets is India. India has been turning out very well-made, intricate cloth for centuries, and now England wants to get in on that game, wants to compete against the Indians in the sale of textiles. So you have these intricate, colorful, well-made cloth that is created to compete with Indian materials. They are manufactured by women and children. The machines themselves are powered by coal, mined by children and adults, and produced by cotton that is purchased from the United States, which is picked and processed by slaves. So we have a lot of labor exploitation that's happening. And something has to give. You remember those restive men that I talked about just a few minutes ago about how angry they feel? Well, we get the emergence of this movement called the Luddite movement that emerges in the early 1800s. And they begin sabotaging textile mills. And when a manufacturing center is destroyed or when its machinery is wrecked, the authorities were looking for somebody who might have done it, and often the reply was that Ned Ludd did it, or General Ludd, or King Ludd must have visited. This goes to a kind of an urban myth, perhaps one of the earliest urban myths of a young man named Ned Ludd, who was a skilled craftsman who was angry at his master for exploiting him, and so he destroyed his master's tools and took off in the night. And so he's kind of this almost semi-mythical figure. And the movement became known as the Luddite movement. Those who resisted change, resisted the mechanization and the diminishing of their role within society and the diminishing of their potential to earn. Protests against manufacturing, which violated traditional labor practices by hiring women and men who were not allowed to unionize, or not, I'm sorry, women or children who were not allowed to unionize or not allowed to join guilds, and essentially that devaluation of labor, saying that I'm suddenly not important because you've got a machine to replace me. This is unacceptable. Well, one of two reactions are possible by the English government. One is to perhaps put in place laws that prevent the abuse and exploitation of labor, and drives the cost of labor up and maybe diminishes the value of expensive outlet or expensive machinery. Because you have to purchase that machinery. The machinery is expensive. You want a return on your investment, so you want to keep labor low. Well, if labor has to come up high and you're going to turn out a similar product, you're probably going to gravitate more and more towards labor and less towards machinery. So that's one way that England could have done it. The other, and unfortunately this is the path that England did take, was to crack down on union protesters against the working class who were angry at the abuse and exploitation of them and their family, and of not being able to provide for themselves, of living in squalid conditions in an environment that was radically different from what perhaps their grandfathers lived in. And so the Luddite movement, was harshly suppressed in 1816 as the English government called out the military and put them down at bayonet points, often shooting protesters. And so there were some extremely harsh penalties that were enacted: deportation to penal colonies such as Australia, sent abroad as criminal laborers in places like Barbados, Tortuga, to India, to Sri Lanka, to all sorts of different places. And of course, anybody caught sabotaging a entrepreneur's machine, it was the same as if they were facing murder charges, and they would be often hung. There was a military crackdown uh, in the city of Manchester, and a dozen people were hung right there in the street without due trial. So due process. They weren't able to face their accusers. They didn't face a judge. They faced a military tribunal because the English government deemed this a civil insurrection, and therefore the protesters were not citizens. They were enemy combatants and could be summarily executed. So we have two sides of industry as we wrap up our discussion of the Industrial Revolution. On the upside, we have faster travel, much more consistent production. We have increased capital, which leads to an increased middle class that are increasingly well educated, increasingly politically active. We have the emergent technical professions that are highly skilled, highly paid, highly respected. People like engineers, mechanics, and managers, accountants, and lawyers, and you name it. Now, there's a downside as well. There's upsides and downsides to both. The downside is there's a concentration of poor and working class in cities. So this leads to all sorts of social distortion, including this massive spread of disease, the proliferation of social ills, things like broken families, alcoholism, domestic abuse, prostitution, criminal organizations. There's an increased pollution of the air and water, especially in cities. Wealth of industrial revolution is not evenly distributed. So the capitalists, those who are entrepreneurs, they enjoy an increasingly cushy lifestyle, an increasingly posh lifestyle, whereas the working class are kept in relatively poor conditions for a very long time. And escape from these poor working conditions is rare, although those who do escape it are held up as some kind of paragons of virtue. If they can do it, why can't you? Because there's a system that's in place that prevents that social mobility. So there isn't as much flexibility as there used to be. And we have a new emergent unemployed. Children, women, men who are maimed and cannot support themselves. You have low and middle skilled men who are unemployed. You have no social safety nets. There isn't the ability to go into a field and pull those little bit of corn that you need to keep alive. There isn't that ability to maybe hunt or beg or whatever. In fact, being a beggar, being a vagabond becomes increasingly criminalized. It's possible for you to be beaten, sent to jail, shipped off to penal colonies for the crime of being poor, of having a negative turn to your luck. Then there's international effects of industrialization as well. As I mentioned before, those cloth that was created to compete with Indian manufacture begins to flood the Indian market. And India cannot compete with England's textiles. The quality increases year over year till the point where it becomes better quality than those produced at home. They're far more durable and they are far, 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 far cheaper. And so over time, India begins to lose a lot of its buyers or its sellers market. It begins to import a lot more, especially from England, and that erodes the wealth and power of a lot of these states that are present in India. And slowly but surely, English economic concerns and political concerns begin to coalesce and take away a lot of the autonomy of those independent states in India. And so by the 1850s, India is essentially a adjunct state to England. England has vast, strong control over the laws and the penalties in India, and enacts laws that ensure its economic dominance. Things like making the manufacturing of salt illegal, making the manufacturing of clothing illegal, making the assembly of people to protest the government illegal, and so on. China is not as interested in English manufacture as the Indians are. They're often disdainful, and they write in many treatises about how poor these machine products are, that they lack a certain soul or a certain creativity. Labor is also still cheap enough in China that they can continue to compete with these manufactured items. So there's a cultural disdain for English manufactured products. Also, the Chinese are not quite as interested in machinery as maybe the Indians or other countries are. And so the British are essentially frustrated by Chinese indifference, and a trade imbalance continues to persist into the 1850s with China and England. England paying way more money to China than it is getting from China. So there's a lot of goods coming from China, a lot of luxury goods coming from China to England to feed that increasingly affluent market, and not as many goods are coming into China from England in order to kind of balance that trade out. Now, there's some food for thought as we begin to wrap up. The revolutions are never really finished. We think of revolutions as very periodic things. In fact, like the American Revolution or the French Revolution are given very distinct time periods. But revolution is more than just people doing an action or doing several actions or fighting a war. It's also thoughts and ideas that continue to persist. For example, the Atlantic revolutions, there's still, even today, a struggle for rights. Even though the Declaration of Independence said we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights by their creator, and those being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Even though that was encapsulated, uh, the right for black men or for poor men or for Native American men or Latino men to vote or to be free didn't come along until much, much later, till the 1860s. The right to vote, the right to be considered an American citizen, didn't happen until the 1870s. The right for women to vote didn't happen until the 1920s, and it's continuing to expand. So there's still struggles for rights, for voting, for representation, and for economic sovereignty. There's also intellectual revolutions. The intellectual revolution, as we talked about in our book, it has very discrete beginning and ending periods. But did it really stop? Do we still believe in the psychological underpinnings of Sigmund Freud? Yes, it has an influence, but hasn't it been refined? So we are still now, today, refining our understanding. We're creating new discoveries. We're expounding on new theories. Uh, Things like atomic weaponry would have been unimaginable to Sir Isaac Newton, who talked about physics. But without his groundwork, we probably would not have gotten to where we are. And more importantly, the Industrial Revolution, although our book and our minds want to say that it was from this period to that period and that's it, the Industrial Revolution is still happening. It is still going on. There is mechanization and automation all around us. They're taking on new frontiers. It's not just the low skilled jobs. For example, when you go to Kroger or if you go to Target or if you go to CVS, you might see self checkout lines. Those self checkout lines, 6 lines supervised by one person, automation. You come in and you provide free labor for the supermarkets to purchase your own goods. You scan it yourself, you bag it yourself, you pay yourself. You don't ever hand money over to somebody else to make them do it. So that's happening with low skilled jobs, but it's also happening with better skilled jobs. Things like advancements for artificial intelligence may replace radiologists or diagnosticians. It also has already begun to replace insurance actuaries that had to go for years to learn their trade is now being replaced by algorithms. Truck drivers, right now, a company is sending a self-driving truck from California to Pennsylvania. I think actually it completed its journey, but nonetheless, truck drivers could be displaced. And that means a whole series of industries that are dependent upon truck drivers could be replaced. Stock trades increasingly are done automatically. And so you don't have those stock traders and those buyers of bonds running around in the pits anymore, making an amazing amount of money for a very stressful job. Increasingly, it's down to 1/1000th or 1/100,000th of a second that stock trades happen. That's so much faster than humans could possibly ever do. And it's all because of the continued industrialization, the continued automation of our world. And 100 years from now, the world that our descendants live in may be vastly, incomprehensibly different from our world today. Just like our world now is astoundingly incomprehensible to those who lived 100 years ago. So we are setting the stage. The Industrial Revolution has changed the way the world works, the way that human beings work, the way that things are manufactured. And so I want you to imagine that you are a European politician in the 1880s. You see industry expanding. It's creating new kinds of manufacture, not just for textiles and food and maybe household fixtures, but also weaponry and the way in which that weaponry can be used. Because machines aren't confined to the industries, to the factories, they're beginning to move out onto the battlefields. Europe is rapidly industrializing. Your armies are getting larger and more well equipped than ever. You still need lots of raw materials to keep feeding your expanding economy. You also need new markets to support your industries. And up until now, up until about 1880, Africa has been relatively lightly colonized, especially compared to Latin America and Asia. So what's the next step? We'll cover that next step on week 9 after the midterm. You guys have a great week, and we'll see you again next week.